Hello and welcome to Hindi Reading Class 4D. We're going to continue on the subject of aspiration with two additional letters. So, you should already know the drill, but please place your hand about 1 inch away from your mouth and say the following words: police, pill, peel, pale, paw, lip. Interesting. What did you feel on your hand when you said the letter P? Well, you're like most native English speakers, you will have felt a tremendous force of wind coming out of your mouth and hitting your hand. So why whenever you're on a microphone, you always get the poof, that poof sound when you say P. You should have felt a tremendous amount of wind. Now, try this. And as you say each word with your hand 1 inch away from your mouth, see if you what you feel on your hand when you say P. Spun, spin, speed, spare, spite. Now, you should have either felt no wind or very little wind. So, what do we learn from this? Well, when P is after S or after some other consonant, which is usually S in English, there is very little air. Whereas when P is by itself in English, there's often lots of air. So what does this tell us? That there's actually two different P sounds in English. One with little to no air and one with lots of air. So how is that going to help us? In Hindi, there is a P that has no air. And this is that P. And if you notice, it'll sound different than the English P. Ba, ba, ba. See, a lot of people, when they're listening to English P, they're listening for the air, actually. If you don't hear the air, it sounds weird. Ba, ba, no air. Whereas the other consonant, this one, is P with tons of air. Pa, just like regular English P. Pa, pa, right? So, how to practice saying pa? Now, this is the one that's going to give a lot of people problems. And when we go a little bit more forward in the lesson, you'll see why this is often a neglected thing in Hindi. But it's also, it's important. So let's start out by saying spun, spun, and you should feel no air. If you feel lots of air when you say spun, like you said spun, you cannot do this exercise. You should feel no air on your hand when you say the P in spun. Now keep saying this. Spun, 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 spun. And then as you're saying this, see what you're doing with your lips and your mouth and everything, your lungs and everything to hold in the air. Because you're actually doing something subconsciously. And now drop the S without introducing the air back. Spun, 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 bun, 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 spun, spun, bun, bun. And hopefully that will be helpful. Now, we're going to learn the curious case of these two letters. So this first letter that you see that we just learned, pa, was originally pronounced only as pa with air, just as we just pronounced it, pa. However, this is interesting that this kind of pa, the one with air, the one we have in English, almost exclusively, except for when it's after a S or another consonant. This is an indigenous sound to India. This pa sound, pa, right? Existed there a long time ago. Now, what happened? What happened is that when Persian speakers came to India in the Middle Ages and thereafter, they brought another sound with them. And that sound was fa. It's the sound of the F sound in English, fa. So now we have two sounds in existing in northern India. One is pa, one is pa, and one is fa. All right. So strangely, over time, as one could assume would happen, because the Persians, the not they weren't Persian, but they spoke Persian as the government language, and because Persian was highly esteemed as the language of government, Indians began to pronounce pa as fa, and it spread. And in some older grammar books, you'll even see these people saying, these British linguists saying, "Oh, and these people think they're so smart by pronouncing pa as fa." But what happens over time? It spreads, and in addition to that, the government policy after partition, sometime later, began to say that we're not going to print the dot anymore for fa. So we have this word here that's saf, which means clean, but we're just not going to print the dot anymore. Forget the dot. We don't need to distinguish between Persian letters and Indian letters. We're not going to do that. And so now, in most cases, you will see saf written actually as sap, however pronounced as saf. Now, today the situation is somewhat complicated uh, for this letter. So this symbol here, the talking about pa, regular pa without the dot, in some areas still, and especially in rural areas, both of these symbols with and without the dot are both pronounced as pa, as aspirated pa, right? P with pa sound with air, pa. In some areas, and this is becoming increasingly common in urban areas, Delhi and other areas, Mumbai, uh, both are pronounced as fa. And so pa from the speech of people in these areas has basically all but disappeared. So they'll pronounce both of these as fa. So once again, in some areas, both of these are pronounced as pa with air, and in some areas, both of these are pronounced as fa. Okay, now we have the third situation, which is in some families, and especially in Urdu, in songs, which are essentially Hindi songs for the most part, tend to be Urdu. In movies too, and TV shows, you can see this as well. And in educated speech, like meaning people were taught to make this distinction in school, we still have a distinction between pa and fa. So, what does that mean for you? Well, I think nowadays, um, it tends to be taught in Hindi that both of these sounds are fa. So if you want to pronounce both of these as fa, that's fine. However, if you ever want to speak Urdu. I would not suggest you doing that because basically you're going to confuse yourself. And when you go to speak Urdu, people are going to expect you to make the distinction between pa and fa. And so it's good if you want to learn Urdu in the future to get into the habit of distinguishing these. Now, we just said that in print, even in our magazines and our books, you will not see a distinction between pa and fa. So how will you know where the distinction is? Now, this is where the dictionary comes into play, because only the dictionary nowadays, for the most part, will make this distinction, and you can learn the distinction. So every time you see a word that has one of these two in it, and you want to know exactly which one it is it fa or is it pa, you're going to have to look it up in the dictionary and see, because the dictionary still has the dot. And that's the only way you can really do it for the most part, unless you happen to have been raised in an Urdu speaking family. So, however you plan to pronounce this character, you're going to pronounce it as pa, you're going to pronounce it as fa, or you're going to pronounce it all, you're going to make the distinction between pa and fa. You should be able to recognize all three by ear. And in addition to this, number one, as you see on your screen, should never have ear. So no matter what you do for 2 and 3, that's fine. But number one should never have ear. It is not the regular P in English with ear. You have to make that distinction. And if you notice, a fa sound, if you do fa with your hand in front of your mouth, still has a lot of air. And so we're going to practice, and you tell me which one it is. I am going to stick to the division between pa and fa. So you tell me which one it is based on what I say. Pa. That's number 2. Fa. That's number 1. Fa. That's number 2. Ba. That's number 1. Pa. That's number 2. Ba. That's number 1. Fa. That's number 3. Ba. That's number 1. Pa. That's number 2. Fa. That's number 3. Ba. That's number 1. Pa. That's number 2. Fa. That's number 3. Pa. That's number 2. Fa. That's number 3. Pa. That's number 2. Pa. That's number 2. Pa. That's number 2. Pa. That's number 2. Ba. That's number 1. 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 Pa. That's number 2. So now let's go through them 1, 2, 3. Ba, number 1. Pa, number 2. Fa, number 3. As 2 have air, pa and fa, and the first one does not. Ba. And here is where I would have you practice saying all 3. So you can do that either now or later in your spare time for homework. Air, air, no air. Remember, as you're practicing these things, always have your hand over your mouth. That's very important, because until your ear is trained enough, you won't be able to tell. So always do this. So what difference does it make? It makes a difference just like all the others. So pal is a moment, whereas pal is fruit. Pak is ripe or cooked, whereas pak is pale. Pakad is a grab or hold, whereas pakkad is uninhibited. Patna to be filled, whereas patna or fatna is to burst. Patakna is to dash down, whereas fatakna is to win up. Pool is a swimming pool. Oh no, not some kind of pool. I forget which one. And pool, pool or fool is flower. Put is a board, and put, sudden movement, fut. Patkarna is to dash down, whereas patkarna is to smash a whip. Patkarna, fatkarna, to crack a whip. Pud is to fall, whereas pud, the gambling house. Perna is to crush, whereas perna is to go around. Firna. Pata is an address or a clue, whereas fata is a victory. Pana is a kind of drink, whereas pana is the hood of a snake. Fana. Palak is an eyelid, whereas palak is a board. Patka is a sash, whereas patka is something that has been winnowed. Fatka. Pusli is a rib, whereas pusli is harvest, something related to the harvest. Fusli. Fusli. Pala is trained, whereas pala is a plowshare. Paltu, domesticated, whereas faltu is rubbish, not needed, worthless. Faltu. And of course, like I said, in some places of India, people cannot pronounce fa, and so they will still say paltu, paltu. And so you're going to have to know that because you will run into people that cannot pronounce fa. For instance, one of my studies could not pronounce fa. And so when he says paltu, when he says patka, when he says pata, when he says all of these things, in order to understand him, you will have to recognize that he is trying to say faltu and all these other things. So for homework, practice the ba sound about an inch with your hand an inch from your mouth until you can consistently say it without feeling air. Without feeling air. Now, once you can say that one, you should already have been able to say the other one because in English we say it all the time. So once you can say ba at will, practice alternating between ba and pa. Ba pa 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 ba pa. And for pa, you will feel no air, and for pa, you will feel air. Now, once you have done the above two, practice saying pa and pa with your hand over your mouth. And once again, I need probably don't have to, but just a reminder, you can say the second one as fa if you so choose. That's quite fine and quite standard for many people in India. So, uh, listen for the difference between pa and pa. And now, that one probably is a good idea not to say fa. So you can get an idea of what the difference is between ba and pa, which we're used to hearing in English. Ba and pa. And then, of course, I didn't put this here, but you can do the writing method where you write the letter, and each time you write the letter, you say it just to get your mind connected with the letter and the sound. So you write it at least 100 times. More is even better. And then listen to as much spoken Hindi as possible and see if you can tell when they say pa and pa. Because a lot of times in music, they are more hold more cleanly to the correct literary standard than the standard average human being. That's on a final note, which I forgot to mention way back here. This is an interesting point because if you realize what has happened in India, this is completely uh, non-essential. You can turn off the video now. But what happened in India is essentially the same thing that happened to Greek. Greek became an international language. Eventually, the PH sound, which was originally pa, became an F sound. And so in English today, we say what? Philosophy, Philo. Philosophy, we do not say philosophy, but philosophy would have been the original pronunciation. Sophomore instead of sophomore, and etc. and etc. All right. Thank you very much, and tune in next time.